Hello everyone and welcome to Podcast Brain. This is episode 20, Language Learning or The Owl Never Sleeps, English version. Today I want to tell you how I learned and still learn foreign languages. I'll talk about my own experience about practicing languages, and I'll also take a look at different systems, methods and tools for language learning, all through the lens of my own life. Before we begin, just a small disclaimer. The very first version was originally recorded in Russian, but I wanted to create the same episode in English as well, to practice my English and to please my English-speaking listeners. And since the topic turned out to be bigger than expected, this will be a two-part episode. So today we'll start the story, and in the next part we'll continue the journey through languages, mistakes, teachers, apps, accents, and all the little disasters that come with learning a foreign language. So let's go! The backstory, or Your Butcher German. I was born into a family where on my mother's side everyone was Russian. And I do not mean blood, I mean language. From childhood to adulthood, everybody spoke only Russian. My grandfather had been through the war and supposedly knew all sorts of words and phrases from different languages. At least that's what he told us. But at home everyone spoke Russian. Of course, they did. It was the Soviet Union. Russian was everywhere. On my grandmother's side, there was also some Ukrainian influence. We had plenty Ukrainian words and phrases in our everyday speech. So I was born in Uzbekistan, in a country where Uzbek also existed. But for us Russians, or Russes, it felt like a hidden language. Of course, there were Russian-speaking people who knew Uzbek, understood it and even spoke it, but they were rare. My uncle always said he knew Uzbek, Tajik, Persian, and a few other languages too, including German, which he had supposedly learned at school and later during military service. And that brings us to the German side of my family, on my father's side. My father's parents were Volga Germans. They were born and raised in the Volga region in Russia. They had preserved their culture and the German language. Of course, it was their own dialect, very close to Swabian, but later, when we arrived in Germany and learned my German myself, I realized that their German did not sound like the German spoken in Germany. Russian had influenced it strongly. They had also over many Russian words. That became a real problem for my grandparents after they moved to Germany. The fridge was still in Russian холодильник, toilet paper was arshpapier, which literally means arse paper. Well, you get the picture. Then I finished the 3rd grade and instead of going to 4th, I jumped straight to the 5th grade. At our school, German was taught by my cousin's aunt. English was taught by my sister by the sister of my mother's friend. And now imagine the early 90s, the collapse of the Soviet Union, American films, adverts, music, pop culture, suddenly pouring in from everywhere. Learning English became fashionable. Films came with those famous nasal voice-over translation by Volodarsky and his colleagues. You could hear the original soundtrack in the background and over this nasal Russian voice saying things like, if you just Google it. And even then I understood the thing that English swear word shit did not really translate as or darn. And because of that I really wanted to watch films in the original. I wanted to listen to songs and understand them without digging through dictionaries or asking other people to translate for me. In other words, I wanted to learn English. Then, at one family celebration before the start of the school year, different uncles and aunties kept coming up to me. They all wanted to know why I wanted to study English and not German. They said, "But you're German. You should learn German." And I stubbornly stood my ground. English is a global language. English means films, music, and communication with people around the world. But how can that be? You're German, these are your roots, your grandparents, your whole German side of your family, even your father, they all speak German, and you choose English. The funny thing is, in Uzbekistan, I never really heard my father speaking proper German. He always answered his parents in Russian, especially when we children were around. Then September came. Those of us who wanted to study English walked into the classroom. I should mention that our English teacher was also our class teacher. Her name was Lyubov Nikolaevna Korshunova. Among the pupils, we lovingly called her Lyubasha. May she rest in peace. And I would be lying if I told you I remember my very first English lesson. What I do remember are the years that followed. Drilling, bad marks, and the attempts to hammer a Soviet-style education into us. Let's start at the beginning, with the system many of us grew up in, or the system our parents knew as the only possible one. The Soviet method of teaching foreign languages rested on several pillars. The first pillar was grammar. Grammar as the goal, not as a tool. You had to know the rules. You had to be able to explain why this is present perfect and not past simple, but actually speaking language. That seems almost optional. And who were you supposed to speak to anyway? The second pillar was reading and translation. The method was called the grammar transition or grammar translation method, and it had been created back in the 19th century for Latin and ancient Greek. Dead languages. Languages nobody speaks anymore. And then the same method was used for living languages: English, German, French. Languages meant for communication. The third pillar was choral repetition. That classic, the cat is on the mat. You repeat the phrase with the whole class. You cannot really make a mistake because you disappear into the group noise and there is no proper feedback. No real correction of pronunciation because the teacher has 30 pupils in the room and 45 minutes for the lesson. Now, one thing is important. I don't want to blame the teachers. Most of them were dedicated people who cared about their work, but they were trapped in a system that was not designed to teach people to speak. It was designed so that a person could read a technical text or maybe communicate with a foreign specialist under very controlled conditions. There was no real language environment. Films were dubbed, books were translated. Traveling abroad was impossible for most people. In that kind of system, a living language simply dried out. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the system changed formally, but the methods did not. They stayed the same for many years. Textbooks had already been written, teachers had already been trained, and nobody had the money to retrain them. Even today, I meet people who studied English for 10 years at school and then at university, and still cannot order food in a restaurant in London. That's not their fault. That's the legacy of the system. What did Lyubov Nikolaevna leave me with apart from a basic foundation in English? She left me with the one fixed idea that never went away. I wanted to visit London. Back then, I had no idea that this dream would only come true 35 years later. Germany and Realschule. Then came 1995. We moved to Germany. A couple of weeks before the move, we were given the chance to learn a few German words and sentences, how to introduce ourselves, how to say our age, and a few other basic phrases. When we were already in our first camp in the city of Hamm, we went to some kind of appointment with a man who was processing our documents. He asked me what my name was, and I confidentially fired off my prepared sentence. Ich heiße Konstantin Müller. Ich bin 1980 geboren. The pronunciation was questionable. The grammar was terrible. But that was not the point. For the first time, somebody spoke to me in German, and I knew what to answer. Later, in the second camp, we were taught German intensively. It was done through games and dialogues. Everything was simple. Speak. Just speak. Don't stay silent. Even if it's wrong, even if you make mistakes, even if it's a just handful of words thrown together, just speak. The teacher will not judge you. Your classmates might laugh, but only because they are just as unsure as you are. They are just as afraid. They are also beginning a new life in Germany. They see that you are trying, but they do not know how to react differently. Their system taught them that, and I stopped being afraid. To this day, I never get tired of motivating people who are starting to learn a new language. The German approach to language learning is built around communication from the beginning. From the first years at school, children do not just learn words, they use them. Maybe with mistakes, maybe awkwardly. That's fine. The real problem is staying silent. German teaching follows the idea of the communicative approach. The concept is simple. A language is a tool for communication, not an object for display in a museum. You learn it by using it, just like a child learns the native language. Not through the rules first, but through immersion, practice and mistakes. In German schools, children start watching cartoons in English without translation. They read short text. They act out scenes. In secondary school, they do projects, discussions, and presentation. Their assessment is not only about grammar, but also about fluency and confidence. Another important point in this language environment: in Germany, English is everywhere. Series are often watched in original, music is in English, games are in English, the internet is mostly in English. This is not just a school program, this is everyday life. And life teaches a language better than any textbook. Of course, the German system is not perfect either. There are problems with pronunciation. There is a gap between children from educated families and those who do not have that kind of support at home. But overall, a graduate from a German school can usually communicate reasonably well in English. Often, they can also manage some French or Spanish. For me, the difference between the two systems is the difference between two questions. What do you know about language? And what can you do with the language? It sounds like a small difference, but it changes everything. I will never forget the day my grandmother took me to register at my first school in Germany. At the first interview, the headmistress was there, and as it happened, she was also the English teacher. Then my grandmother, either because she was tired of translating everything for me or because she wanted to show me off a little, said to her in German, "My grandson can speak English." And that moment I realized I was in trouble. The headmistress immediately switched to English, just like a click. She started explaining something to me while also translating parts of it into German for my grandmother. I sat there nodding, catching single words torn out of context and doing my best to look as if I understood everything. Then she said, "The first break will be after the first 2 lessons in the morning. The next break is after 2 hours. Between the classes, there might be a break of 5 minutes. And I sat there thinking, damn, she keeps saying break. I only knew that from that word from boxing. The referee says break when the fighters are hitting each other and have to be separated. She's saying that if someone starts fighting at school, we need to call break. If someone going to come and separate us." Then she translated to my grandmother. Nach den ersten beiden Stunden gibt es eine Pause von 15 Minuten. And suddenly my brain opened. Enlightenment, angelic light from above. Boxers are told to break because it means pause. She's talking about the break between lessons. Hallelujah! And in that moment I understood something very clearly. My famous English, the English I had been learning for 4 years, was complete rubbish. I could not really speak English and I had not learned German yet either. And you know what? Instead of falling into depression or disappointment, I realized that it was exactly the push I needed. German I would learn anyway, because I had to. But English needed to work too, because at least I already had a base. A poor base, yes, but I could read. I could read phonetic transcription thanks to Lyubov Nikolaevna, who had taught us that back in Uzbekistan. My classmates in Germany had not learned transcription. I had, and that gave me an advantage because I could work with dictionaries more effectively and understand pronunciation in advance. So I started working on myself. I learned 2 languages at the same time and confused them often. So how did I learn German? At the beginning, I could not attend and understand all the normal school subjects. So in certain lessons, I went, together with several other pupils, to German classes for foreign children. Next to me sat children from India, Afghanistan, Arab countries, Turkey, and several other countries I have long forgotten. The teacher, who may have taught history or German or politics, I honestly do not remember, patiently explained rules to us. She gave us homework and vocabulary to learn, but she never translated words for us into English or any other language. Instead, she taught us to explain words with other words we already knew, sometimes with our hands, feet, facial expressions, and any tool available. She encouraged us to speak, not to be afraid, to make contact with people, to ask questions, and to ask again when we do not understand. In other words, she did not only teach us German, she taught us communication. So I went home and worked with a dictionary. I moved towards my goal. Maybe the goal itself was not the most sensible one, but I wanted to sound like a German. I focused on pronunciation and useful phrases for communication. And maybe that is why I did not pay enough attention to grammar. I learned nouns without their articles, although articles are one of the most important things in German grammar. So, if you are learning German, always learn noun with its article. Never skip it. I worked with a dictionary. I read a little, newspapers, magazines, and so on. I watched series in German. I did not have the internet at the time. It came later. For me, personally, it arrived in 1997, when the first internet cafe opened in Essen. But the internet did not help me much with language learning because my friends and I mostly sat in Russian language chats and wrote Russian in transliteration. I also did not want to forget Russian, as happened to many people who had moved abroad. I finished Realschule with a grade of 3 in German and a grade of 3 in English. And no, that did not stop me from continuing to listen to and understand music in English, watching series and films in German and speaking Russian at home. As I learned other languages, I also began to think more about the origin of words in Russian. Words like Rucksack, Schlagbaum, Tangenzirkel, and so on and so on and so on. Gymnasium, Abitur, and university. A small but necessary detour. In the early 2000s in North Rhine-Westphalia, where there were gymnasien and some specialized schools when you receive the full Abitur only after year 13. So you finished the year 10 and could start vocational training. After year 12, you could go to a University of Applied Sciences. But for a proper university, you needed the Abitur. During the Abitur years, you collected points over 3 years based on your grades. Every grade had a point value. For example, 1 plus was worth 15 points, 1 was worth 14, and so on. To be admitted to the final exams, you had to collect something around 200 points. Then came the exams themselves. They were where the grade you received was multiplied by 5. Altogether, you could reach a maximum of 600 points, which were then converted into an average grade. Not every subject counted equally. In year 12, you choose 4 main examination subjects. 2 were written main subjects, called Leistungskurse. 2 were basic courses, Grundkurse. Of those, 1 was written and 1 was oral. Of course, that did not mean you only attended those 4 subjects in the year 12 and 13. Other subjects still added points to your total. But your chosen subject mattered most, because they were the ones in which your points carried the most weight, and they were the subjects you finally sat exams in. The main written exams lasted 6 hours, the basic written exam lasted 4 hours. The oral exam, if I remember correctly, involved around half an hour of preparation and half an hour of presentation, something like that. In year 12, I chose mathematics and geography as my main subjects. For the basic courses, I chose physics and English. They were the subjects that interested the most. I hoped I would write the physics exam, and with English, I thought I could freestyle my way through the bit with a bit of blah blah blah. How wrong I was. In the second half of year 13, I realized, or rather I was told, that my physics teacher had absolutely no desire to create and later mark a written exam just for me. As it turned out, I was the only person who wanted to take physics as the written basic subject. So he told me more or less directly, if I have to create my exam just for you, only for you, I'll simply fail you. You have no choice. I advise you to take the oral exam with me. That's it. No choice, pure blackmail basically. So I had to register for physics as an oral exam. That means I had to write English, and maybe that is exactly why my marks in physics and English ended up worse than I would have liked. In the end, I prepared reasonably well for physics. English was a bigger problem. So I took extra language courses, and that is what I want to talk about now. To prepare for the English exam, I went to different tutors, both private teachers and a proper language school. One private teacher was even a Portuguese. At that time, I did not really distinguish accents very well, and what mattered to the most was grammar. My grammar, just like my German grammar, had always limped along, and I no longer had much hope of fixing it completely. But at the language school in Essen, in Lingua, the same school where my parents had once learned German after arriving in Germany, I got a biker from London. I do not remember his real name anymore, so let's call him Bob. Bob had come to Germany on a motorbike. In England, he did not have formal teaching qualifications. In Germany, the easiest thing for him was to teach English on a simple course called Brush Up Your English. We came to the course and basically talked. We worked on pronunciation, we learned slang, idioms, and non-textbook English. In the first lessons, I heard real British speech for the first time, real pronunciation, and I understood almost nothing. But over the time I got used to it. I began to hear the difference. I began to understand that British people did not pronounce words the way Germans, Portuguese people or Russian pronounce them. And yes, I know somebody will now want to tell me that Britain has dozens of dialects and accents. That's true, but that is not the point here. Here I'm focusing on the difference between British and American English. It was with Bob that I began to love British English. Whether it was RP, some standard Yorkshire or Oxford accent or even Cockney. And yes, I also adore Scottish English, at least the way Scots speak English with that rhotic R and words like I, we, bonny and can. That love of British English and those lessons with native speaker made me understand something. For me personally, and probably for many people, in the best and highest quality way to train a language and pronunciation is to learn from a native speaker, from someone who was born and raised in that language. I do not want to insult anyone, but you will not learn even Russian properly if the person is teaching you speaks with a very strong foreign accent. You will copy that accent. If your teacher is Indian, you may pick up an Indian accent. If your teacher is from Central Asia, you may pick up some Central Asian pronunciation. If your teacher is Japanese or Chinese, well, you understand. So once you have a basic foundation, even if it's just a handful of words, look for a native speaker if you can afford it. And if your goal is to sound closer to a native speakers. Otherwise, you may remain stuck at "Hello, my name is Kolya, I'm from Moscow, Russia, and London is the capital of Great Britain." And this is probably a good place to pause for today. We've gone from my first encounters with languages through the Soviet school system, the move to Germany, my first painful realization that knowing English and actually understanding English are two very different things. But the story doesn't end here. In the second part, we'll continue with some other very interesting things. So I hope you enjoyed this first part, and I hope that you stay with me with the part 2, because the owl is still very much awake. This was Podcast Brain, and I'm your host, Konstantin Müller. See you next time. Bye-bye.